Hello, Cloud Gurus. A really cool feature of Kubernetes is this idea of virtual clusters, and they're called namespaces. Now, namespaces aren't something that I would recommend most people who are new to Kubernetes start creating and using, but it's still important to understand exactly what a namespace is because by default there are a number of different namespaces and all the Kubernetes system resources are running in a different namespace than what you have visibility to. So let's talk a little bit about namespaces. A namespace is a virtual Kubernetes cluster within the same physical cluster. So let's say that I create a pod or a deployment in my default namespace. The name of that pod or deployment has to be unique. However, that's not the case if I create a pod or a deployment in a different namespace because it's in a different virtual Kubernetes cluster while still running in the same physical Kubernetes cluster. For example, let's take a look here at our namespaces diagram. Here we've got 3 nodes and they're running a number of pods. In this example, we have one namespace called the Apple namespace, and these 2 pods are in that namespace. Then we've got another namespace called the Orange namespace. And again, 2 pods are in that namespace. Now, namespaces can contain other types of Kubernetes objects besides just pods, but we're just using pods in this example. Now, we could name the first pod in the Apple namespace Fruit. That name is unique in the namespace. We could also name the first pod in the Orange namespace Fruit as well, because it's unique within the namespace. It doesn't have to be unique across the cluster. However, if we go to name the other pod in the Apple namespace Fruit, that's not going to be possible because there's already a pod named Fruit in the Apple namespace. So we have to get rid of that name, and for example, we could call this pod Red. And then in the Orange namespace, perhaps we call the other pod Orange. Again, just some simple names for pods and simple names for namespaces to help demonstrate the fact that names must be unique within the namespace, but they don't have to be unique across the cluster. If you just have perhaps 5 or 10 Kubernetes users using a cluster, namespaces probably aren't something that you need to worry about at this point. But as your cluster grows and the types and number of applications grow, it may be beneficial to you to create new namespaces. By default, you'll have at least 3 different namespaces. They are the default namespace, which is where we've been creating all of our pods and deployments, the kube system namespace, which is where all the Kubernetes system pods run, and the kube public namespace, which is created automatically and all users, including anyone who's not authenticated, can see what's running in the kube public namespace. By default, however, there's no pods running in kube public. And depending on what you have deployed in your cluster, you may have other namespaces, which you'll see here in our Minikube cluster in just a moment. To help you view the status of your namespaces, there are a few commands you should know. The first and easiest command is kubectl get namespace. That'll show you what namespaces are available and currently configured in your Kubernetes cluster. You can also specify which namespace that you're referring to when you run common Kubernetes commands such as kubectl get pods. You can specify -- namespace equals kubesystem, for example. If you want to set the default namespace for your kubectl client, you can do kubectl config set context -- current -- namespace and specify the namespace. And that way, whenever you run any kubectl commands, they'll be run in the namespace that you've configured. And finally, to check and see what your default namespace is, you can do kubectl config view and grep for namespace. Now let's jump over into the lab and work with namespaces. I encourage you to follow along. First, let's run kubectl get namespace. And here you can see we actually have 5 namespaces already configured. The default, kube node lease, kube public, kube system, and the Kubernetes dashboard. And these were all created by default when we deployed Minikube. If we run kubectl get pods, you can see the pods that we have running in the default namespace. However, if I run the same command, kubectl get pods, and use -- namespace equals kube system, you can see there's a whole different list of pods that are running over in the kube system namespace. And those pods provide the Kubernetes master services. Let's say that I wanted to change my default namespace for my kubectl command. I can do kubectl config set context --current namespace equals, and let's say kube system. It says the context minikube was modified. Now if we just type kubectl get pods, we don't have to specify the kube system namespace with --namespace. We've set the default to kube system. Now if we type kubectl config view and we pipe that to grep namespace, you can see our default namespace is now set to kube system. If we up arrow and we go back and we set our namespace back to default, which is the default namespace, and type kubectl get pods, we're back in the default namespace. So those are the fundamentals of Kubernetes namespaces, a very cool feature of Kubernetes that allows you to create virtual Kubernetes clusters within the physical Kubernetes cluster. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.